Now we have time for some questions for Dr. Murthy, and then we'll open up for reflections on both presentations and take some of the questions that we didn't get to in the first round. So at the back, Joe. I see another hand over there.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm really interested in this claim that you and Scott have both made that's up here in the questions. Adaptive randomization is complex but benefits study participants, and how to build that into informed consent. Because in one respect, that seems to be correct. That is, it's better for the patients than if they were to be in a straight one-to-one randomization, as Scott was describing. Because you can say you're more likely to get a treatment that benefits you if we do adaptive randomization, right? So that's clear. But if you imagine it from the perspective of the patient who is being told this, what you're saying to them is, we have reason to think that treatment A is superior to treatment B. Nevertheless, even though, given what we know, for your sake, you'd probably be better off with treatment A. We're still going to give you a chance of getting B, the treatment that we currently have reason to think is inferior. Right? So it really throws up to me the extent to which you're saying to a participant, we want you to take this potential hit because we want to get better evidence in order to test whether our current hypothesis is the right one.
No,
Does that make sense?
I completely understand the comment and have sort of wrestled with this myself. And I'm not sure if I have a good answer for you. And I think in one of the readings, that was our argument, the exact argument was made. Scott, have you thought about this?
I've thought about this a lot. So there's a couple aspects of this. First of all, we have to reach some level before scientifically this would be adopted. And we're asking them to contribute to learning as well. If we stop with a 71% chance an arm is better than another one, we haven't moved science at all. And we haven't benefited those patients outside of the trial. But also, contrast this with what's done now. The exact same data may exist in a one-to-one-to-one trial, and you have 50% probability. It doesn't relieve the ethical burden that the data's there and it exists and it's the same thing and you're doing 50-50-50. We're randomizing in a way that's going to increase the likelihood of finding out what works, and at the same time it increases your probability of getting a better arm. Yes, there are times where we think an agent looks better than another one and we'll randomize patients to that. I think it's less than in a setting of one-to-one-to-one. And you can't say we didn't look at the data, relieves you of an ethical burden.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Sorry, could I just... Oh. So I guess then it's a question of whether it's about the consent part or or about the risk benefits, right? Because I think you're totally right. In the one-to-one-to-one, you're just saying, and we're not allowed to look at the data. Yeah. So yeah. We, or I, the clinician, don't know. Whereas in the adaptive one, you're like, no, we're looking at the data every week. So we're getting that feedback. Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, the known.
Yeah, the gentleman there, yes.
Hello. I think that was an interesting talk about case studies. One of the things that I'm really concerned about is mainly about, if I'm a patient in front of you and you tell me about the adaptive randomization to say, you know, we're changing the allocation depending on the results, right? I might be tempted to come back a few weeks later because I know by then maybe I've got a better chance of receiving a better treatment. So what are the implications of that with respect to ethics and also with respect to statistical issues as well? That's my question. Thank you.
Like the same argument could be made from a quality improvement perspective. If you have an ongoing project, patients who are at the very beginning of that project compared to patients at the end will have different standards of care. And you're right that patients at the end of the trial will be more likely to be enrolled in the better performing arm than patients at the beginning of the trial. Is there a way around that?
Oh. I would not
speak into the microphone.
I would not look for a way around that. It's better to get Ebola next month than this month.
Yeah,
and hopefully our system is smarter a month from now. If you extend what you said, that it's unethical to treat somebody in 2 months smarter than we do now, means that when the results come out of a trial that demonstrate something superior, we shouldn't give that to patients outside the trial, because patients a couple years ago didn't know that knowledge. I don't accept that that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. Yes, you should get sick later.
So you want to follow up? Okay.
So,
And then we'll-
I was more concerned about maybe population drift, where participants who are sicker might be treated earlier, and those who are not sicker, they might be willing to wait a little bit longer.
Yeah, there are diseases, perhaps chronic diseases, that you would have this concern. We run into this in various rare diseases where there's a set of people that jump trial to trial, and then there's the natural ones. So in different diseases, you may be concerned about different patients at different times and the statistical ramifications. We worry about that a great deal with Ebola, for example, that the disease itself drifts, and the patients at the different point have different levels of severity. Hence, we do adjust for time within the trial, and we have to in many of these perpetual trials.
So we seem to have reached a natural point to drift over to a broader conversation that was raised. And there were some hands earlier, and I believe here at the front, Dr. Gray, you had a question that you wanted to ask? Oh, so we wait for the microphone to come. And then I see a hand at the back.
It was answered. It was the question about I understand the master documents, but I wanted to know how you went about submitting the drugs to the regulatory authorities and that. But I think you answered it.
Okay.
Is that the ethics committees get to the regulatory authorities and the ethics get to see the drugs. That's what I want to know.
So there's a gentleman at the back, and I'd ask people to put their hands up high for the eyes of the aging moderator, and don't give me the kind of auction-like gesture. So at the back, here at the front, and then over there.
First of all, I want to thank for the great presentation, and I want to follow up a little bit the question from Carla and the answer from Dr. Berry. I found very interesting that the very first time in this meeting, we heard that the reason for getting this, I will put like alternative designs, should not be as alternative, because in this time we are talking about that this is the best design to answer a question. So I probably would like to invite all of you, if we can change this mindset on thinking that, okay, we will take these alternative designs because we couldn't do the best design, and saying probably the best design is what we are calling as alternative design. So this is my first point, and I would like your comment. And the second point is, if we agree that this kind of design is the best one, why we are not using this design leading to the licensure of an intervention?
So I hopefully the science continues, and 5 years from now we've got better designs, and the science of design improves in that. It is now, these designs are now being used for licensure of drugs. There's been a sea change in the last 5 years. The FDA is on board. They're asking for this. It's being used in areas where things don't tend to work. It's harder to do. You can enroll in the US an obesity trial in a month, and we don't really need to do adaptive things. But in rare diseases, in pancreatic cancer, in glioblastoma, in various things, we need better trial designs. And so these are being used for approval, absolutely.
Okay.
And I agree with your statement that
Don't call them
this is the
alternative.
search for better trial designs, not worse trial designs.
So the trial that I mentioned is currently being performed in adults, slightly modified version of it, obviously, in, I think, 4 different countries around the world right now and expanding.
So it's interesting, the trial he's referencing, the Prepared network in the EU, is there to run a trial in community-acquired pneumonia, and then if a pandemic breaks out, The trial immediately says, I'm interested in that pandemic, and it already has the protocol it's rolling in patients. But meanwhile, we're learning about community-acquired pneumonia.
Okay. How about the front, Peter?
Yes.
And then over on the left.
I had a couple of questions that are more for Scott, I think. One is, from my limited understanding, I thought the most statistical power was from actually balancing the endpoints, not from balancing the enrollments. And so even if it's just a two-arm trial with the adaptation and having, accruing more endpoints, accruing more endpoints in the more effective arm is not just the right thing to do ethically, but also more powerful statistically. And then my second question was just about the 7-day, the looking every 7 days, and that happens to be very convenient with the week, and you can do it on the same day of the week and everything else. But does that depend on the disease, and something that has a more indolent process would be longer, or the enrollment and accrual? And if you didn't have any new enrollments in a week, you probably wouldn't be looking at the data again. So if you could just talk about sort of the trade-off of how you come up with a week in that process.
Okay, so the last question, the 7 days, yes, there's a convenience. We do trials sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, sometimes 3 months. It really, the efficacy of that depends on how quickly your data changes and comes in. So if we're doing an oncology trial with 14-month median survival, doing updates every week, the data doesn't really change and you don't add anything in that setting. The nice thing is if you do an interim, you get the same answer you had last time and there's no harm to it. Just data doesn't change. So we spend a good bit of time investigating the right frequency without adding unnecessary operational burden in the trial, where we will get updated data during the course of that. No. And it's a bit of a, you lose statistical power, and it's even, too many people, we pay a penalty.
Yeah.
You don't pay a penalty, you redistribute the ability to win at different time periods. In that, and we reference the alpha drops at our very last analysis, so we call that a penalty, but we've actually redistributed and moved it throughout different points. But what you do at the interim determines if you even pay a penalty. So we've run trials that have SPAs with the FDA, 40 interims, and we pay 0 penalty, because what we did at the interim doesn't inflate type 1 error. So it's the action you take, it's not the fact you looked at the data. When the election for Trump happened in November, I looked at that thing every minute hoping I'd change the outcome, and it didn't really work. And so looking at it doesn't affect it, what actions you take. The balance is an interesting question. If it comes down to what question you're trying to answer, if you're trying to separate two arms, a control and a treatment, you want the same error in both of them. In most endpoints, that's equal randomization. There are some weird settings where you have more variability on one of the two arms, that it's better to be one way or the other. You might have prior information that it's better to do 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. But you want a balance of information to then separate them statistically, gives you the highest power. And that's almost always 1-to-1.
Do you want to address the endpoint question? Then we've got 1, 2, 3 questions. I think the first point you asked was about the endpoints.
Yeah, so that was the balance of the endpoint.
Okay.
Sometimes we do phase 2 trials where it's not just statistical separation, but it's understanding side effects and tolerability. So they want more experience on the experimental arm. So we'll do phase 1 and phase 2 trials with differential allocation, because the question is not statistical separation.
Okay, there, then to Catherine, then to Anat, and then the last question over here. So then the next one, the microphone to Catherine.
Okay. Good afternoon. I can hear the designs are becoming complex, but what I'm afraid is that I don't know how you are keeping the IRBs who review these designs on board, because usually what delays reviews and approvals is the fact that in most cases the IRB team is not at the same level as the science. So what is being done to keep us at your level of complexity?
This meeting.
Yeah, we worry about the complexity. We worry about this becoming a black box for people who have to understand it and approve it. We have spent a good bit of effort on this. So the I-SPY 2 is a breast cancer trial that have 13 different agents, has gone through it, much like what I described for Ebola. And there we brought all the chairs of the IRB in for a weekend and we explained the design and got them on board. You may not be able to do that in a low, middle income setting. And it may even be a disparate set of that. And so this is a challenge. It's a challenge to be able to explain to the review boards. And it's a big challenge because I believe it's a better thing for them. I really believe we're bringing them a better design and better for their patients, but it's how do we explain that? How do we do it in a way that we can get that message? And we don't look like just a bunch of computer black box people that make everybody nervous as to what it is we're doing. So it's a big challenge.
Catherine?
That third point, which ethical work is required before actually proceeding with something like this. We're running surveys with ethics boards in various parts of the world to see exactly what they know about this kind of design and what they want to know and how we should sort of disseminate information. And so videos and information sheets and these kinds of things to help ethics boards sort of walk their way through some of these concepts, which are admittedly complicated.
Catherine?
Mary's question was in essence my question, but you said that you've got an adult study going through 4 ethics review boards. So I guess following on from that, what did you have to do in order to get it through the ethics review boards? And how easy or time consuming was it? And I think we've now come back almost full circle to Ross's opening about the meeting of statisticians and ethics. And I think this is something that this meeting has the ability to grapple with because we have both audiences in the room. So I hope that this will be picked up in the discussion and we can add to your comments about what kind of materials or training or information that recs need across the globe to be able to understand this. And it's not just recs, it's other people outside the research, because I think Ricardo, picking up on Ricardo's point, changing the vernacular from its being an adaptive to its being potentially the one we want to use and not the alternative, I think is critical. But yeah, just curious as to how you got it through the current ethics and how hard it was.
So I personally did not have to bear that burden, but close colleagues of mine, it took an extended back and forth with multiple ethics boards to get to a point where they are right now. And the consent model diagrams that I showed you were changed and changed and changed again as they continue to...
Adaptive consent.
So a really interesting interaction in that case with the Australia IRB that so there's reasonable equipoise on how you set the ventilator for an adult. And they said if you're going to do 50-50 randomization on these patients, you need consent. If you're going to do adaptive randomization and you're learning what works best, you can get a waiver of informed consent, because you're now treating patients in a way consistent with what you're learning, and it's not an experiment, it's a learning healthcare system.
Anant, and then somebody had their hand up over here. There are 1 and 2. Okay.
So, given, Srinivas, your concerns around provider biases or preferences, is there maybe a role for almost having some kind of an artificial intelligence approach to this, where it's actually not an individual or a group of individuals taking those decisions on a weekly basis, but rather a more unbiased, neutral algorithm, which is already built into the design but seems to be deployed right now by humans. So that's one. The other thing is, for designs which are purist based on, say, a fluid versus an oxygen, versus designs which actually let that creativity at the provider level of wanting to mix those up or combine them rather than just having one intervention versus the other, especially from a clinical perspective, because you have tapering of fluid requirements, you have tapering of oxygen requirements, which might change week by week depending on the situation of the patient. So having to sort of have them only choose one intervention and one particular dosage versus actually having that clinical flexibility, how do you deal with that? in design?
The problem, I guess, with giving clinical flexibility is you lose the randomization aspect to it. And so without assigning a group in some way, you lose the integrity of your analysis. And so then it becomes more of an observational study of comparative effectiveness of various different interventions without the actual intervention. The first question I remember, sorry. So a lot of it is within the algorithm. The algorithm will give you which allocation group is doing better and which intervention to do more of or less of. And so there's less human involvement in those week-to-week decisions than people think. They look at the data, but it's all driven by an algorithm, and that's correct, right?
And just there may have been a misunderstanding. Well, you said there were 3 separate trials. You combined together one intervention from each of the 3 in a factorial way. So you weren't getting one of these but none of those. You were actually being assigned one of each of those. So the algorithm's learning about the synergy perhaps across them as well.
Gentleman in the middle, and then somebody at the back raised their hands. There we go. If we can get the microphone there.
No, but yell, I guess. Or...
Thank you. So this might be getting into some more of the details, but I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about issues like blinding, and especially if you add a new intervention after you've been running the trial for a while in a way that it breaks blinding because you didn't realize that this was a 4-dose regimen and you've been working with 2-dose regimens. Issues like that, and also the transition from this platform design to non-inferiority design. Once you've decided this is a good combination of drugs, now you want to add another one. Are those things that seem relatively seamless and are no more difficult than traditional designs, as many of the questions have already that you've already answered, or are there particular issues? And then one other quick question in response to something you just said. You said that because it's a learning healthcare system, you don't need consent, but I guess at the start of the platform trial, it's in essence no different than a randomized controlled design, so I don't understand how it couldn't be conceived of as research, at least at the start. Thank you.
So the blinding is one of the we refer to single blind and double blind. There's now a triple blind aspect of this, is that you could be blinded to active or not, your caregiver's blinded, but are you blinded to which possible drug you got in the setting? We tend not to blind somebody as to over 6 arms in a setting. We're doing this with an Alzheimer's phase 2 trial funded by the IMI. And you're blinded as to whether you're active or not, but you're not given a shot every month to blind that you're not in that arm as opposed to an oral pill there. So you can still be blinded active to not, but you know you either got A or A's placebo. In the Ebola trial, nobody was blinded. And that was not a dictation of the design. No matter what they ran, they weren't going to be able to blind individuals within the trial. So that was unblinded anyway. But you can blind various parts, but because agents come and go, you rarely triple blind and give them multiple masking agents over the different arms. I'm sorry, non-inferiority, yeah. That would be easier in a trial like that. We haven't had that. What we have had is during the course of the trial, one of the agents demonstrated superiority. That became the standard of care, so we replaced the standard of care just as the trial went on, and it was able to keep going. We didn't have to stop the trial and update it. We haven't gone to one where it went from superiority to non-inferiority. It remains superiority to what then was the standard of care. But it would be natural to do that. You could design it from the start to do that if that was intended.
One last question at the back, and then we'll take one more over here. So here, and then we'll bring the session to a close.
Yes, thank you for the interesting presentations. So I'm coming from the angle of the IRBs, and I've seen some IRBs actually sending back some protocols and just saying this is just a shell. there is no information that has been provided. But I want to add also that I've seen that IRBs are also very, very flexible, provided the researchers provide adequate information and give them some ideas in terms of how the researchers intend to proceed as they are conducting the particular study. So it's very, very important to be upfront with the IRBs and let them know that one of the advantage for the adaptive designs is it makes things easier, even for the researchers, as they are going to go through in introducing the different agents that are going to be tested through that particular trial. But more importantly for the IRBs to know that at any point as they are going to be introducing the different agents which are still in the process of development, they are still going to come back to the IRBs and proceed that way. So as long as the IRB is aware of the plans, that there are these things that are in development, I see them actually accepting these ideas and cooperating with the researchers in ensuring that the studies can be conducted efficiently.
Thanks. Do you want to respond?
I agree.
I agree. I think that's why meetings like this, where researchers and statisticians and ethicists can all get together and sort of talk about these issues, are absolutely crucial, because this is going to come more and more frequently as more and more different types of trials happen.
And the world's already becoming a better place because of it. Okay, last question there, and then we'll break out groups.
Yeah, that's me again. How do you minimize the chances of premature early stopping? Do you have got a banning period that you say, I'm not going to activate the randomization until I've got X number of patients?
Yeah, I mean, it's critically important that we don't create a design that based on one death here and one survival here, we put all our eggs in one basket and it rolls with that. So we're creating algorithms that are going to reflect uncertainty appropriately, many of them Bayesian in that setting. But then the trial design, you can't construct one of these and write it down and then go run it. You have to simulate it. It's much like we design our airplanes, our bridges, our cars are all by simulation. This is computer-aided design. And making sure we simulate it in hundreds and thousands of scenarios, making sure we don't inappropriately drop arms, that we've got good characteristics of it. And my fear in these designs is in the middle of the design it says to do something and it's inappropriate. But if we've simulated and explored and vetted it over and over and over again, we know that whatever we send at it's going to do well. So we worry about, that's really one of the very first things we worry about. And in the design, we make sure we construct something that doesn't do that, because then it's a worse design.
Excellent. Well, very stimulating panel and stimulating presentation. So join me once more in thanking Drs. Murthy and Barry for a fabulous conversation. Thank you.